Hello mortals, Discordian Kitty here. It's official, we are in new expansion waiting room territory. The sun is setting on the wall within and soon it will be midnight. So before we leave Khazar-Gar, we've already left it a few times already. Before we leave the wall within and head over to Quel'Thalas, maybe there's time for one last drink. It is Brewfest after all. As we sit and reminisce over the story of the war within and ask ourselves, what exactly went wrong? Because now that the expansion is wrapping up, while I remember enjoying almost every part of it, I have to admit the story has left me feeling a bit like I've spent the last 2 years doing nothing. Which is crazy, right? We've done lots of things. We fought Nerebians, met whole new groups of Arathi and Earthen, liberated Undermine, and even saved the universe. So why does the War Within feel so much like it's been a side quest? Did the story really jump around as much as people say? I want to say no. It's perfectly easy to understand how every story beat led directly to the next one. And when the whole story starts out with Locust Walker telling us about Dimensius and Koresh, and eventually leads to Dimensius and Koresh, it's a bit silly to act like Dimensius and Koresh came out of nowhere. And yet, I can't quite put my finger on why, but there's something about the War Within story as a whole that just feels unsatisfying. So let's go through the story just one last time and try to figure this out. We began the War Within with the Radiant Song as our World Soul's whispers were heard all over Azeroth. At first, we didn't understand why we were hearing these whispers until Locust Walker revealed something similar had happened on his own homeworld, Koresh, just before it was consumed by the Void Lord Dimensius. Because Magni Bronzebeard is Azeroth's speaker, we went to find out what he knows. He had been having trouble with Azeroth, who apparently hadn't been taking his cause, but eventually manages to get through her spam filter just long enough to see a vision of a land under attack that needs our help, Khaz-Algar. Which brings me to the first weird story moment in the War Within. The fact that Khaz-Algar is just there. It isn't behind the storming sea or hidden by mists or anything like that. It's just an ancient land that apparently no one's bothered to visit for who knows how long, but only because they didn't really feel much need to, not because it's that difficult to get there. With every previous location we visited, Blizzard have gone to great lengths to explain why we've never been there before. With Khaz-Algar and, as it turns out, Undermine, apparently it's just that the people of Azeroth don't really see much point in visiting places unless there's some dire need to go there. You'd think someone like, say, Varian or Garrosh would have at least scouted the area for potential benefits to their faction. Even if the Isle of Dawn itself is deceptively small, the giant city in the middle of it didn't cause any curiosity at all. It's different to something like Kul'Tiras or Zandalar because those places were known about, but there were reasons why the factions were avoiding them until recently. It wasn't just a case of because no one's thought to bother with them before. I find the lack of curiosity curious. Possibly because of things like the Dark Portal and the fact that we do have the ability to travel through space and time and even into other realms like the Shadowlands, exploration has become something that the people of Azeroth just don't really bother with much anymore. In fact, Koresh has also turned out to be a place that we probably could have visited at any time, we just haven't had much reason to until now. Maybe the fact that there is a near infinite amount to explore is just too overwhelming, so people by and large don't really bother. Maybe it's a bit like flying. One argument that I don't agree with, but that people bring up a lot when defending things like pathfinding, is that flying takes away a sense of exploration. Nobody bothers to look around at places if they can just fly over them. Again, I don't understand this myself. Flying always makes me want to explore more, but apparently this is a common thing. I realize I'm probably overthinking this. The real reason why no one in-universe had visited Khaz-Algar before is because Blizzard hadn't added it to the game yet. It's the same reason that no one's bothered to take the working spaceship that's available to us to visit the other side of Azeroth. You'd think someone would, but with a game like World of Warcraft, we also have to make allowances. Blizzard needs to have the freedom to introduce new areas without having to come up with increasingly absurd reasons for why we've never been there before. So, we haven't visited because we just haven't. Fair enough. Still, it wasn't the greatest introduction to Khaz Algar or to the Earthen who live there, because you have to ask the question. If no one's really seen much point in visiting this place or these people until now, then how important are they, really? Anyway, Magni had told us about Khaz Algar needing help. Archmage Drendon, who had recently been reappointed to the Council of Six, convinced the mages of Dalaran to throw their full weight behind the mission, Flying City and all. Which brings me to the second smaller issue in the War Within's early story. Archmage Drendon was a previous member of the Council of Six who disappeared sometime before World of Warcraft started. He reappeared shortly before the War Within and was welcomed back into the Council without question. One of the most important and prestigious councils in Azeroth, with a very exclusive membership. Drendon simply walked into a position that several other characters, most notably Aethys Sunreaver, another former council member, have been trying to claim for ages. One might argue Aethys has a better claim to the position. He left it far more recently, and the dispute he left it over has long since been resolved. Obviously, Drendon turned out to be Xal'atath in disguise, but it is very weird that everyone fell for this one. Again, no one's heard from him for years. Even if he wasn't Xal'atath, so much has changed since he left. It was frankly irresponsible to just hand him that sort of power again. And Khadgar knew to look out for Xal'atath's trickery. It's just a story beat I wish they'd taken a little bit more time with, because it leaves characters like Khadgar and Alleria looking very stupid, even for World of Warcraft characters who are never expected to be great thinkers to begin with. Anyway, Xal'atath revealed herself before using her very powerful Darkheart artifact to destroy Dalaran and seemingly kill Khadgar, stranding us on the entrance point to Khaz Algar, the Isle of Dawn. Once in Khaz Algar, we met some very old Earthen with severe memory loss problems who were super loyal to the Titans and who were dealing with an onslaught of Nerubians who were now following Xal'atath. Shortly after we arrived, the Nerubian destroyed the Coreway, a giant passage that leads directly to Azeroth's World Soul itself. The Earthen managed to repair the Coreway as far as the Ringing Deeps and haven't repaired any more since. A lot of us expected more of the Coreway to open later, helping us to journey to the center of Azeroth, but that just didn't happen. Possibly because the Earthen have left all repairs to this poor guy, who I suspect is working much harder at making it look like he's working than actually working. We did what we could to help the Earthen of the Isle of Dawn, before heading underground to the Ringing Deeps, where Magni saved a bunch of Earthen from void corruption by giving up his diamond form. We also met goblins there who hadn't come with us. Apparently, after centuries of being pretty much left alone by everyone else on Azeroth, Khaz Algar had turned into something of a hotspot. Oh, and we met some kobold. The less said about them, the better. Then we went to Halafor with Anduin, which turned out to be quite recently populated by Arathi from the Arathi Empire, which is somewhere across the Storming Sea and was established by Arathi from the Empire of Arathor, which used to be in the Eastern Kingdoms around the area of the Arathi Highlands, but that was long ago. The last living Arathi we knew about was Anduin Lothar, who Anduin Wrynn is named after. But it turns out not even the Lothar are all dead, because one of the Halafor Arathi is named Farron Lothar. The Arathi in Halafor were sent away from the Arathi Empire, not the Empire of Arathor, don't confuse them, by their emperor to fight in a final battle between the light and the void known as Rennalash. The Arathi Emperor has visions, and he saw a vision of this battle. He also saw a vision of the light crystal that lights up Halafor, which the Arathi have called Beledar, the Emperor's vision. In more recent years, Beledar has started regularly turning to the void. Anduin and Alleria figured out this has been happening ever since Azeroth was stabbed by the sword of Sargeras. During his time in Halafor, Anduin and Farron Lothar grew pretty close, and she helped him finally reconnect with the light. It may sound like I'm pointing out flaws here, but honestly, Halfor and the introduction of the Arathi was one of the highlights of The War Within. Rule of cool wins out here. It's hard to have much bad to say about an experience that starts out like this. And the Arathi have been an almost perfect example of conventional moral heroes that have a darker, or rather light-infused undercurrent that hints at a tendency towards zealotry and the sort of light that blinds everyone who follows it, which is a lot more interesting than people who are pure and holy or cartoonishly evil. It's also kind of nice that no one's screaming the Arathi Empire is scrapped content just because we haven't visited it yet. Everyone seems to understand that it's a place we're hearing about now because we're going to be visiting it one day in the future. So all in all, Halfor is great. After Halfor, our last original zone was Az-Kahet, a zone of Nerubians who aren't undead but who were working for Xal'atath under the leadership of their new queen Antorek, who organized her own promotion by assassinating their previous queen, her mother. Not all the Nerubians were happy about this change in leadership, so we made some spider allies and began plans to assault the Nerubian palace. Alleria spent a bunch of time chasing Xal'atath and failing to hit her with any arrows. Oh, and during this time we met Owena the Haranir, who's very upset about the black blood that's been spilling all over Khazal-Gar and the threat it poses to the mysterious roots her people are guardians for, and to the goddess that Owena worships. Her people don't seem quite as bothered as she does. They're more upset with Owena's tendency to speak to us when they prefer to have nothing to do with outsiders at all. There has been a lot said about Owena and the Haranir. Early War Within data mining may have suggested there was a planned zone known as the Rootlands, though I have to say I have never personally seen solid evidence of this. There was also the data mining that Wowhead did, suggesting that the Haranir could be designed to be a playable race, something that's now been confirmed. A common assumption is that the Haranir story was originally meant to play a bigger role in the War Within, but was moved when the decision was made to make the Worldsoul Saga trilogy. A lot of people who were lucky enough to be given Gamescom interviews chose to make this one of their questions, to the point where I started to feel frustrated on behalf of the Blizzard employees, who of course were never going to be able to outright say, yes, the Haranir zone was going to be in the War Within, but we moved it to midnight. Honestly, I don't think it matters, but I do think the combination of those Rootland rumors, the evidence of playable Haranir, and the Owena parts in this War Within cinematic created an expectation that the Haranir were going to play a much bigger role in the story than they did. But if you put aside that expectation, knowing that Owena and the Haranir play a role in Midnight, I really feel like Owena's introduction in the War Within has been fine. We've gotten to spend enough time with her to get a feel of who she is and what her people are like, so by the time we do spend more time with them, it will feel familiar instead of something brand new out of the blue. Frankly, I'd like to see more foreshadowing like this. Back to Az-Kahet, where we also met more goblins, and found out that they were from Undermine. See? Foreshadowing. Undermine didn't come out of nowhere, they were building up to it from the start. But I still feel like there was a bit of a tonal shift in the way that Undermine was introduced. Before, we had been told Undermine was basically one of those lost locations thanks to the eruption of Mount Kajara. The World of Warcraft Ultimate Visual Guide states that the ultimate fate of Undermine remains unknown. There have been hints that Undermine may have fallen under the control of one of the less savory cartels, but the general idea was that most goblins didn't know how to get there. When Gazlowe met a goblin from Undermine in Az-Kahet, he seemed super interested, even willing to look past the fact that she worked for a disreputable cartel because he wanted to hear more about where she came from. But then during the Undermine patch, it turns out Gazlowe's always known where Undermine is, has always been able to go there, and just doesn't want to. It doesn't quite line up, which is fine when it comes to contradicting the Ultimate Visual Guide. It would be a bit weird to expect every word from a Mists of Pandaria era promo book be treated as if it's irrefutable fact, but the shift from one patch to the next can't help but give the impression of a story that's been put up before the details have been finalized, which I suppose is exactly how World of Warcraft works. They work on the general structure of the story far in advance and then fine-tune it as they get closer. When that's how things are done, these minor tonal shifts now and then are likely unavoidable. but they can sometimes make the story feel less than well thought out, less polished and planned, more making it up as we go along. And if there's one thing that really makes this expansion feel that way, it's the War Within's key art. Here we see Thrall alongside Anduin and Alleria, suggesting he was meant to have a role at least as big as either of theirs. And let's just say he did not. So did The War Within get heavily rewritten quite late in the story, leading to all these little hints that something different was originally planned? It's possible. It's also almost certain we'll never know for sure. But with that, we were ready to move on to the max level campaign. The war against Xal'atath was going to require even more forces, so Thrall and Jaina were sent to fetch some from the Arathi Highlands, which used to be the location of the Empire of Arathor's capital, Strom, now Stromgarde. Not the Arathi Empire, that's across the Storming Sea. And as it happens, the humans of Stromgarde have been feeling super nostalgic about their Arathi heritage lately, which they've mostly translated into motivation to attack the Magar Orcs, who are originally from alternate Draenor but who have recently settled in Hammerfall. The Magar are led by Gayara, Thrall's sister. Actually, she's not Thrall's sister. She's the person who was born instead of Thrall to alternate Durotan and Draka on alternate Draenor, but we deal with that by thinking of her as Thrall's sister. Anyway, the humans aren't supposed to attack the orcs because of the official armistice between the Alliance and Horde, but Stromgarde's king, Danath Trollbane, has been hanging out with us fighting in the Xal'atath War. He's the one who suggested we get more forces from the Arathi Highlands, and so his niece has been ruling in the meantime, and is a big xenophobe who has been causing all the trouble. So Maren was put in prison, and Thrall and Jaina returned with reinforcements. And if you don't remember all of this, or thought it happened much later and with Fair and Lothar, that's because this all happened in a short story. And then most of it happened again, later on, during the in-game quest line you're thinking about. I'll get to that later. Let's see, the max level campaign. Thrall helped the Earthen with their elemental stormrooks. The Earthen, who have been mostly very loyal to the Titan's edicts, decided they needed to break them in order to help us in the war, setting off a Titan failsafe of a giant construct that was meant to come out of the ocean and destroy them. We found out the Nerubian's old queen was still alive but had been transformed into a monstrous creature. We also helped the Ringing Deep's Earthen prepare some war golems to use in the war against Xal'atath. Xal'atath went after Halafor, apparently wanting to do something to Beledar. In a confrontation against her, Alleria shot at Xal'atath's dark heart, damaging it badly and also releasing Khadgar, who is alive but now has a new magical wound to go with his whole age prematurely thing. Now, the max level campaign has some amazing moments, but I think this is where the War Within story really started to have that disjointed feel. The Earthen, the Arathi and the Nerubians have very little to do with each other before the events of the War Within, and it shows. During the max level campaign, there's all this busy work as we dutifully visit every zone, preparing for our war against Xal'atath, but it's very hard to feel like organizing the war golems is important when ultimately all we really needed was Alleria finally getting a shot in. In fact, Alleria's part here, well, more on that in a bit. We also raided Nerubar Palace, which was clearly meant to be spelt with an apostrophe rather than a hyphen, another minor detail that helps contribute to the War Within's general unpolished feeling, and killed Queen Ansurek. This didn't seem to annoy Xal'atath nearly as much as breaking her dark heart did. Again, more on that soon. We also found a bunch of Titan records calling Azeroth the Prime World Soul, and that in order to ensure she is born a Titan, the Titans have wrapped her in a world-spanning network of machines known as the Manifold. This was a bit of a surprise because up until now the Titans always told us that all World Souls are naturally Titans, but also not really because we kind of figured out they were lying long ago. It was also revealed that Azeroth tried to reach out to Earthen to save her, turning them diamond like Magni. And this whole thing is why the Titans decided the Khaz Algar Earthen aren't allowed to go all the way down to the bottom of the Coreway or have proper memories. Mostly this revelation doesn't matter a whole lot to the story of the War Within, other than it seems to motivate the Earthen to be even less reverential of the Titans than getting attacked by a Titan failsafe did. But it is clear it's going to matter a whole lot to the overarching story of the War Within. It's not the most advanced questline in the world, but the information it provides is decently interesting, and it's nice that it's there to discover for the people who care about the lore. In time, some goblins found an interesting island a little bit away from Khazalgar with a big singing glowing crystal in it. They went to investigate along with some Earthen as well as some Arathi from Halafor, who don't ever leave the zone because they're sworn to stay there and protect Beledar, except apparently for when they do leave. Siren Isle turned out to have a history involving a Vrykul named Circe, a light-infused crystal that may or may not be made of the same stuff that makes Beledar, and a tendency to summon terrible storms. But it's not in the storming sea, it just happens to be surrounded by storms for another reason. We also found out the island used to be inhabited by Kul Tiran during Battle for Azeroth and is now haunted by their ghosts. All very diverting, but ultimately not very important. Back in Khazalgar, the mages of Dalaran were grappling over the fall of their city. They ultimately decided it was caused by their own hubris and tendency to interfere in Azeroth's affairs, and resolved to change the Kirin Tor completely. And if you're wondering what hubris and interference, well, so am I. The only real big recent mistake I can think of is the fact that they reinstated Drendon to the Council of Six without even taking a minute to ask him where he's been for the last few decades. And even that isn't an example of interfering with the world's affairs, it's just a case of not properly monitoring their own affairs. If anything, Dalaran has been too hands-off lately. There have been a few situations where their help might have been helpful. This is one of those storylines where you really feel that whole Blizzard writing the broad strokes of the story and then filling in the details later thing, because the grand conclusion is certainly there, but the details to make it make sense feel like they're missing. This questline also represents another problem that's kinda been growing for a while. I've mentioned Rule of Cool before. Problem is, Blizzard have been sacrificing a lot of cool lately. Dalaran, a floating magical city, is cool. It has always been one of the coolest locations in World of Warcraft. The Council of Six is also pretty cool. This tiny council of some of the most powerful mages in the world, it sets the stage for a lot of intrigue. Of course power like that would go to people's heads. Of course it would cause a lot of trouble. Of course, sometimes they'd end up infiltrated by other powerful and mysterious beings, like dragons in disguise. Of course it's probably a bad idea. All of that is what makes it interesting. But after deciding they've been too prideful lately, even though, again, I don't know what they're talking about, the mages of Dalaran have been downright dull in recent years, they make this decision to throw everything that made the mages of Dalaran interesting out of the window.
Let us pledge, then, that the new Kirin Tor will be different. No more councils, no more floating cities, and no more meddling in world affairs.
Why would you promise no more floating cities? Who sat down and decided that the problem with Azeroth is the floating mage city just wasn't boring enough? And who even asked for this humble, self-reflecting Council of Six? Where is the fun in any of that? The only thing I will say is I'm hoping, like anything, that at least some mages rebel against this new Kirin Tor, decide that actually they do have a lot of power and should rule the world and build their own flying city. If every hero character is going to be boringly moralized to death, then please at least let the villains be interesting. The final major storyline from the Siren Isle patch features Orwena, who had some more visions from her goddess that convinced her to spend even more time with us, investigating the Black Blood. This upset her people even more and got her pretty much ostracized. It also introduced her to Gazlowe and Renzek, and Renzek was a major character in the War Within with a ton of speaking lines who at no point was given a voice. This probably wasn't Blizzard's fault. I'm repeating speculation here, but it seems likely any missing voices were due to the voice actors' strike. Still, it was unfortunate timing because that lack of voice acting was another thing contributing to that general unpolished feel this expansion's been plagued by. Then a wall exploded and opened the way to Undermine. Are you keeping up? This is all very straightforward. Undermine was in a bad way because it had been fully taken over by Galliwex, last seen in the Shadowlands but who was back apparently and also super powerful. For years, we thought no one knew what had happened to Undermine after Mount Kinjara exploded, but it turns out that wasn't the case. Anyone can go to Undermine, they just choose not to. Anyway, it also turned out Xal'atath had hired Gallywix to fix her dark heart, and that he was using the black blood that his goblins were mining in, for example, Khazar-Gar, to do it. See, the story ties together perfectly logically. Now don't you feel silly for thinking Undermine was a side story? Gallywix did manage to fix Xal'atath's dark heart and handed it over to some Shadow Guard Ethereal, who everyone assumed worked for Xal'atath because during previous quests we'd seen them working for Xal'atath. Anyway, we were all wrong. The Ethereal absconded with the dark heart, leaving Xal'atath very annoyed and, once again, her plans temporarily thwarted, as she needs the dark heart for whatever it is she plans to do to the World Soul. By this point, we'd obviously thoroughly decided to overthrow Gallywix, which would only be the easier because Xal'atath immediately abandoned him the moment he stopped being useful to her. So, once again, we headed into the raid to deal with something other than the expansion's overarching threat, which had already pretty much been disabled, at least temporarily, before the raid even began. And I'm beginning to spot a major problem with the War Within story. The order feels all wrong. Even before an expansion's final raid, the final boss of previous raids should still feel more urgent than Ansorak or Gallywix did. In Ansorak's case, yes, she was the figurehead that represented Xal'atath's Nerubian allies, but at no point did killing her seem to slow Xal'atath or her Nerubian allies down. The real damage was done before the raid, when Alleria shot the Dark Heart. So while Alleria didn't turn up in the raid to steal our kill of the boss like Illidan did with Gul'dan, she did kinda do the same thing. Alleria did what mattered, what drove the story forward. We were just sent in to sort of clean up, which doesn't make the player feel like they have a very active role in the story. As for Gallywix, well, I had an absolute blast fighting him to the point where I'm still hoping he manages to come back somehow just because of how great a villain I think he is. It's impossible to ignore the fact that his rule wasn't really a life or death situation for our world. We just sort of dealt with him to help out the goblins of Undermine. A noble enough cause, but the sort of task that could have probably been trusted to a handful of Horde players instead of the combined powerful forces of all the champions of Azeroth. Meanwhile, if we skipped visiting Undermine completely, the chances are very high that the Ethereal would have still gotten the Dark Heart from Gallywix anyway. This, I think, is why Undermine especially feels like a side quest. Not because important story doesn't happen, the Dark Heart being repaired and stolen are both very important story beats, but because our role in it is basically unimportant. We don't help drive the story, not really, we only get to witness it. There is a lot more I can say about the problems with Undermine's story, but I've already covered most of it in other videos, so for now, let's move on to the next couple patches. The Goblins of Undermine settled into new leadership while the Shadow Guard Ethereal took the Dark Heart to Koresh. For the second time, the war with Xal'atath was in pause mode, but Bronze Dragons still decided to set up revisiting Horrific Visions to learn all we can about the Void, because something about it might come in useful? Honestly, I'm not going to complain too much about that one. I'm frankly amazed that they managed to tack on any story at all. Hallerfall also started getting attacked by more Nerubians, still loyal to Queen Ansorak. You know, just in case you thought killing her made any real difference at all. Farron Lothar, meanwhile, reached the point where she felt she could no longer stay in Hallerfall, not when there was a whole world to see and new friends to help. She accepted Anduin's invitation to go with him, and when an opportunity came up to visit the Arathi Highlands, she leapt on it. The Highlands had descended into hostilities again. Turns out, imprisoning Marin didn't stop the humans from reliving the glories of the past by attacking the orcs along with any other non-humans, including members of the Alliance. Farron helped Danath and Gayara as they resolved the issues in the Arathi Highlands for the second time. This time, Farron was going to execute Marin, but Danath stopped her and had Marin exiled instead, presumably because he recognizes a good potential plot device when he sees one. In other words, yes, this is pretty much the same story we had already experienced in the short story, only now in-game. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. For example, quite a bit of Malfurion's story in Legion is similar to events that already happened in his novel Stormrage. And I don't necessarily hate the general idea of giving players an opportunity to experience these stories in-game. I just think it should be the same story. The same basic thing happening in the Arathi Highlands twice in a row isn't necessarily outside the realms of possibility, but it didn't really help a whole lot with the feeling that Farron's inclusion was sort of patched on, because we had just witnessed essentially the same story happening without her. It's honestly really unfair to Farron, who deserves more of her own story, not to feel like she was crowbarred into some spare story they had lying around as a bit of an afterthought. Again, I can go on more about what bothered me about the legacy of Arathor, but I've done that already, and we really need to wrap up here. So anyway, remember how the Ethereal took the Dark Heart to Koresh? It turned out they were planning to use it to resurrect Dimensius the All-Devouring, who we all thought was killed during the Burning Crusade. And honestly, our first reactions might have been, who cares? Dimensius was quite easy to kill. We didn't even need a raid to do it. But it turns out that was only a fragment of Dimensius, one of thousands or more that were scattered throughout the universe, that the Shadow God Ethereal have been carefully collecting for thousands of years. And with the Dark Heart's assistance, they're hoping to use them to resurrect Dimensius to his former glory, when he really was the All-Devouring. If they succeeded, Dimensius would destroy not only what's left of Koresh, but everything in the entire universe. Locust Walker brought the news to Alleria, and we all agreed to head to Koresh, conveniently reachable by a portal. Apparently, who needs spaceships anymore? And help stop this sudden universe-ending threat. And because the threat was suddenly so dire and so dangerous and so much more threatening than, say, Gallywix had been, Locust Walker agreed and convinced us to agree to work with the most unlikely possible ally in this fight, Xal'atath herself. Alleria hated the idea, but had little choice but to go along with it, and we learned a great deal about the history of Koresh, of Locust Walker, and even of Xal'atath, who had been the harbinger of Dimensius back when he devoured Koresh. Xal'atath betrayed Dimensius, helping Locust Walker transform the Koreshi into the ethereal beings we know today. But as it turns out, it was Locust Walker and his friends who destroyed Koresh. Dimensius didn't devour it after all. They did it to protect Koresh. Blowing up the planet was the only way to stop Dimensius, and it was this that scattered fragments of the Void Lord throughout the universe. In general, Koresh has provided a variety of fun times and hijinks, and is generally a good time, providing you forget about the existence of the bequests. The strain of the Rishi ribbons on the story can't help but feel a little forced, but not so much that it destroys the experience. In the end, though Dimensius still wasn't the main villain we've been focused on throughout the War Within, destroying him felt like it really mattered. He threatened the entire universe after all. At the end of the raid, it turned out Xal'atath was helping us partly because she planned to not only retrieve the Dark Heart, but to have it empowered by the Void Lord as well, a plan that she quite easily pulls off. But because Xal'atath was by our side during that fight, and gained her new power as a direct result of our actions, this is the raid where we feel a lot more involved in the main story of the War Within, rather than occupied with side quests while the NPC characters do all the important bits. Of course, by this point, the Earthen Goblins and certainly factions like the Kobold are long since forgotten. And yes, there are always factions in every expansion that don't necessarily play a role all the way through the main story, but there's usually at least one faction that remains important throughout. The Earthen aren't really involved with Koresh, they have their own problems. The Arathi aren't really involved with Undermine, they have their own problems. The only really consistent character throughout the major points of the War Within, apart from us, is Alleria, who isn't even from Khazal-Gar. Even Khazal-Gar's zones lack something consistent that ties them together. Undermine is underground like most of the others, sure, but Koresh is a whole different planet. In the same way, even though there's always a reason why one story beat leads to another, War Within's story is still somewhat all over the place. Some of it is about Xal'atath and the Dark Heart and leads into Midnight. Some of it is about the Earthen and their relationship with the Titans, and the Titan hold over Azeroth, story beats that likely lead into the Last Titan. Some of it is about the looming threat of the Arathi Empire and the fanatical side of the light, story beats we may see a little more of in Midnight, but that will probably only really be covered in the expansions after the World Soul Saga. None of this would be much of an issue. Foreshadowing is good and should happen. But I guess the problem is that it's all received about the same amount of emphasis. The Arathi, whose story will probably only really start to matter in a few expansions' time, got a huge amount of focus throughout The War Within, while Orwena's story, which is about to become a lot more significant in the very next expansion, was touched on so briefly it left players feeling like some of it must have been cut. Meanwhile, Locust Walker and the Ethereal's tie to Xal'atath, the story that took us from the start of the expansion to the end of it, really only shows up in those places, the start and the end. And of course, there were those consistent problems of the player being sent to do things that didn't really feel like they mattered even as we were doing them, while an NPC did most of the things that actually drove the story forward. I've said this before, but I think the problem with the War Within story is that it was Blizzard's first time attempting something new, the first chapter in an expansion trilogy. Every expansion has story that sows the seed for future story to come, but the War Within had to set up not only story that will come after the World Soul Saga has been wrapped up, but story that will be important in both of the next 2 chapters of this saga. There's also the fact that because Blizzard has 3 expansions to tell the story instead of 1, they've had the luxury of being able to spend some time metaphorically stopping to smell the roses. If The War Within was supposed to be the whole story and not just the first chapter, then it probably would have been impossible to include, say, Undermine. A lot that doesn't directly serve the main story would have had to be cut. If we were always heading towards Koresh, we would have probably reached it a lot sooner. And for the most part, I think Blizzard feeling like they do get to take their time and enjoy themselves with some focus on what might once have been considered forgettable side quests is a good thing. But players haven't quite gotten used to it yet. And all of this combined with the general mismatched feeling of Khazar-Gar just, in my view, didn't quite work. The War Within never really felt like it had a proper central theme, unless you count following Alleria around, who again is hardly strong enough to hold up an entire expansion. Thankfully, Midnight, with its setting of a location as iconic and established as Quel'Thalas, already doesn't have that problem. So, as the sun sets on this expansion and video that turned out to be far too long, let's all drink to the coming darkness that might just save us all. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, share, all the good YouTube stuff. And of course, you can help me in thanking my Patreons, who really help make sure these videos happen. You may have noticed I've been a bit quiet. Some real life stuff means I don't have a lot of time right now, but hopefully I'll still manage to see you again soon.